Diversity often makes us feel unsafe. So whether you're Black, brown, Asian, Hispanic, Caucasian, whatever, we're looking for safety. And safety usually comes in people that we are most like.
This idea of finding God in differences seems like it's core to Jesus and his mission and his incarnation. But our world is really wrestling with this.
What we're trying to do is bring people into the story of God and saying God is at the table. The table should be the safest place where you can share your story, be invited into the story of God.
You and Hannah, your wife, work with interracial couples.
A recent survey suggests that by 2050, that 50% of the marriages in America will be interracial. Not every culture has it all right, and not every culture has it all wrong. And this is what the church should look like. There's differences we can celebrate. And I would contend that this actually is the movement of the gospel.
So Nirup, how in the world do you function? How is it that you have not had a laptop for a year? Do you just use carrier pigeons? Like, how do you live?
I've only had a laptop for a year. So I use hardcover journals for everything. I handwrite all my sermons. I just literally on Friday got Logos on my computer. So a friend of mine works for Logos and he just said, this is sad. You have to catch up to the 21st century. So finally catching up to it. So I'm not actually sure how all a computer works yet, but I do, still rock my iPhone from, I think 2007. So, but I'm just, I don't know. I'm old school. I love books. So everything I do is with books in front of me.
Oh man, we are kindred souls. The biggest conflict I have with my wife is I just want books. I want lots of books. I want bookshelves, and I don't want them to have space for vases and flowers. They are bookshelves, not vase shelves. And I want all of the books near me. And for some reason, I'm married to somebody who has a hard time understanding that. So God bless you. You are in the center of God's will.
No, that's right. I think you and I are cut from the same cloth. My side's darker, but same cloth.
That gets us into what I want to talk about. So this is Nirup Alphonse for everybody. You have joined us at Become New. And we're walking through this series thinking about how do you find God in your world? The truth is you're going to do life today. You can do it with God. You can do it without God. And the invitation is do it with him. It'll be a better life. And that's what I'm talking about today with Nirup. He is hilariously funny. I've listened to talks that you've done at Taylor and other places. You have an unbelievable sense of humor. I don't know where that came from.
Oh, it's probably my dark childhood. I had to find escape for something. So that's what my wife says. My wife says I mask my pain in humor. There's probably some truth to that. There's probably some truth to that. So
yeah, well, I think most people who are funny, that's the kind of thing that gets said about them. But it also kind of gets into these days. We're just walking through for everybody. Where do you find God? How do you find God in your world? And what I want to ask everybody to do while I kind of tee this up for Nirup is think about somebody different than you. Think about somebody, maybe their age, their generation is different, ethnic culture, different political views, different religion. A friend of mine who works a lot in counseling with a lot of couples says the primary challenge for marriages is just differences, just people that are different. And I know that for you, you're leading a church, LifeGate is called in Denver?
LifeGate, yep, in Denver, Colorado.
And a big passion has been to create a community that is multi-ethnic and intergenerational. And as we think now the Advent season, it involved Jesus coming into a particular ethnicity and where he was in Little Israel with the Roman Empire there, all kinds of ethnic issues, challenges, problems going on. So we're not the first people to face that. And then he started this very strange community where part of what the Bible talks about is he tore down the dividing wall of hostility. And people that were separate, now all of a sudden they're thrown together. So this idea of finding God in differences seems like it's core to Jesus and his mission and his incarnation. But our world is really wrestling with this, and the church wrestles with it. So I'd love to hear, how did that passion get born in you, and how are you discovering finding God with people who are all different from each other?
Yeah, I think it's a really wonderful, beautiful question. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Jesus we could say he was lost or he was wandering away from his parents when he was a young boy, and he ends up in the temple. And I love the question that Mary, his mother, asks him. It says, where have you been? Your father and I have been looking for you everywhere. Where have you been? And I love Jesus's response where he says, don't you know I would be in my father's house? And I think for me, that's one of the most intriguing stories, because we have a world that is looking for God, whether or not they're willing to admit it. There is a search and a hunger for God. And I wonder if the reason we don't find him is because we're looking in places he's not. So Mary and Joseph are looking everywhere except for the place they should have been looking, which is Jesus saying, if you knew me, you'd know I'd be in my father's house. And so I think for me, it's constantly asking the question, am I finding Jesus? Are we finding Jesus in the place he said he would be? And for me, all of my theology, all of my practice, orthopraxy, as a church, we would say the central place that we are aiming to find God is at the table, as practical as the table of the Father, the table of fellowship, the breaking of bread, the place of rest, the place of communal discovery. And the table for me comes down to one word. It's the place of safety and story. It's the place where I can lay out my story and be safe. And I would make the case that what humanity is looking for is a place where they can feel safe. And the reason I say this is because one of my, again, favorite stories in the Bible is when Adam and Eve, they both sin for the first time and they hide. They're hiding to feel safe. And God comes and he says, where are you? And at this point in the story, God has never shown himself to be callous or to be rude or mean or angry or wrathful. And so why are they hiding from a God who has never been anything other than perfect? And God says, where are you? And I think what they're doing, covering themselves, is they're trying to find a place of safety. And I think this is humanity's looking for, a place of safety. So whether you're black, brown, Asian, Hispanic, Caucasian, whatever, we're looking for safety. And safety usually comes in people that we are most like. So I tell people this all the time. If I were to take you to India and you were white or you were black, you're now in a sea of brown faces. If you saw one person that looked like you would be drawn to that person. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong about this. It's human nature to move to someone who looks like you because there's something about safety, about being with people. This is as classic as Rudyard Kipling, the strength in numbers, the strength of the pack is the wolf. And so we want to move towards people that make us feel safe. And so diversity often makes us feel unsafe. We're entering into a story we don't know. We're entering into a language we don't know. We're entering into experience, a culture, a story that we don't know. And what we're trying to do is bring people into the story of God and saying God is at the table. The Father is at the table. The Spirit is at the table. The Son is at the table. And the table should be the safest place where you can share your story, be invited into the story of God. And then we tell people, none of us, no human being can carry the weight of someone else's story. We cannot carry the weight of someone else's story, but we can create the space for that story to be held as sacred. And so how do we grieve with people? How do we celebrate with people? How do we have moments of joy and moments of sadness? So for me, everything comes down to the table because I was raised at the table. I grew up overseas in a communal experience of life. It wasn't until I moved to America that I really saw this kind of ideal or this right to self-determination, the right to self-autonomy. And it's even infiltrated the church in many ways. And so I grew up at the table. I grew up with 7 nights a week. There was people in our homes on Christmas Eve. Yeah, on Christmas Eve, my father I grew up in India. On Christmas Eve, my father would open up our home and men with leprosy, which is just a cultural, would never happen that you would see men with leprosy. And my father is handing my brother and my sister and I gifts that we bought throughout the week and handing it to these men with leprosy as my father is sharing the gospel of redemption and reconciliation and restoration into a family. And so I just saw this my whole life. I just saw the care for the poor, the creating space at the table. My wife and I are so different. I mean, on every level.
You also work with, you and Hannah, your wife, work with interracial couples and help them. How do you build marriage? How do you deal with those kind of differences with each other? Tell us a little bit about how that's played out for you and Hannah as people are thinking about either marriage or friendships or something and working with differences.
Yeah, absolutely. So a recent survey suggests that by 2050, that 50% of the marriages in America will be interracial. in some way, shape, or form. Yeah. And as I look at our staff, the vast majority of our staff are interracial. And so marriage is difficult in just in general. Two very different people coming together, converging, and then the two becoming one. The Bible says the two shall become one, and this seems magical. I know it's going to happen overnight. And it's a movement of two stories becoming one story. And then you mix in interracial, where it has distinct cultures, distinct values, distinct languages. So in our case, part of the thing that I grieve is that I can't communicate to my children in their in my mother tongue or first language, because my wife doesn't speak it, which means it's hard to conversate at home. So we teach them a couple of things here and there. And so introducing language or food is difficult. A couple of years ago, I asked my wife, and I said, if somebody walked into this home and there's no indication that an Indian lives here, there's nothing distinctly Indian, not even a decoration, nothing. And for her, it didn't even occur to ask that question. How do I create a space for this? And for me, I never felt, even though I was married to my wife, I never felt comfortable to ask my wife this question, because in my world, I've always had to be, subservient to whatever the majority culture wants. And so so learning how to be, I'm the model minority and we shouldn't do these things. And so what was really fascinating is my mom knows that I started this church. She knows that I'm the senior pastor. She knows this. But a couple of years ago, I brought one of my coworkers, employees, with me to go see my parents in Portland, and he's a white guy. And when he walks in my parents' house, my mom says to him, "Do you work at LifeGate?" And he says, "Yeah, I work at LifeGate." And she says, "Oh, are you Nirup's boss?" In her mind, she could not imagine a world where her brown son in ministry doesn't have a white boss. And he says, "No, I work for him." And you could have seen like her mind was exploding. It was this moment she had, she called her sisters, we've made it. White people work for our kids. This is her mind is completely blown, because even in her own imagination, she couldn't see a world that existed where white people would work for me, because she grew up in a world where my dad, who's the most educated in the room, walks in and he's still reporting to people who are less educated than he is. So these are all difficult conversations to navigate, which can only be done in humility, vulnerability, courage, honesty, and gratitude. All of these have to move together to have honest conversations about my wife and I. We grew up in two very different ways of discipline, very different ways. I walked in one day and my son is sitting in a corner by himself, and I'm asking, what is this? She's like, "What's a timeout?" I'm like, "What is a timeout? What is it?" She's like, "Oh, it's when they get in trouble, they sit in the corner." I was like, when I got in trouble, we had to go outside and find a stick. Okay, we had to search for the appropriate stick that would be appropriate for the amount of wrath that my parents had, in order to. Everything is different. Money is different. Approach to ministry is different. But what we had in common was our love for the Lord, our love for the church, and the ways in which we wanted to walk the way of Jesus. And for us, hospitality was the number one practice that my wife grew up with and that I grew up with. Hospitality, growing in that way together. And so being able to create the space for intergenerational, interethnic. I actually don't prefer the word multi-ethnic. And the reason I don't is because you can be multi and never actually work together. So the example I use is I played college basketball at Trinity International in Chicago. And I tell people, most people, they look at me and they think, well, he must have been on the team just to keep the team GPA up for everyone else who was actually good. But I actually was on the team. And I would notice the way that my black teammates and my white teammates would have breakfast when we go to hotels and things like that. And I would notice, same plate, most of my white teammates would have their eggs, bacon, pancakes, potatoes. It was on one plate, but they were separated. Whereas my black teammates would get the plate, they'd put the pancake on the bottom, the eggs, the bacon, the potatoes, everything would be stacked on top. And then they would pour the syrup over all of it. It was like the Holy Ghost falling over all things. And that's kind of how Indian food is. The food is all mixed together because each food, though distinct, enhances the flavor of the other. And this is what the church should look like. This is what our families should look like, where we are distinct. There's differences we can celebrate. Not every culture has it all right, and not every culture has it all wrong. So we can put it together and we can now, each one is enhancing the flavor of the other one. And that's the kind of church we want to have, the kind of family we want to have. And I would contend that this actually is the movement of the gospel. And so the gospel is not just, well, you're saved and you're reconciled to God, but there is now neither Jew nor Greek, nor male nor female. In the gospel, Paul in Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, meaning the gospel has this movement of we are reconciled to God and we are restored to one another.
So Nirup, it's so inspiring to hear that kind of vision for what life can be like, what the world can be like, what the church ought to be like, what God's intent was. It seems like a lot of times in American culture, the idea of diversity, equality, inclusion can be associated in a lot of people with more of a secular mindset than actually with the message and person of Jesus. So somehow something has gone wrong somewhere. Say a little bit more about how you find Jesus, how you find God as you look at differences amongst human beings.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it's interesting. Many people now wrongly see creating space for people at the table as sort of a social imperative rather than a gospel imperative. That the gospel moves to reconcile and restore one another. And so, the early church was the first time in history you walk into a room and you see people of different ethnicity and races and ages. But the Philippian church started with a Greek slave girl, a Roman GI, and an Asian fashion designer. And then Paul, this Jewish convert who's a Roman citizen. You're thinking, what language did you speak? What food did you have? Where did you meet? How did you sing? All these things together. And yet this is the picture of the church moving together. And somewhere it became a movement of homogenous movement because we have disconnected the gospel from what it actually is. We've disconnected the theology of being saved and the reality of being moved together as one new humanity. And I'll give you where this really came to light for me. I'm in my college class at Trinity, and the topic of discussion in my missiology class was whether or not churches in India should create churches based on the caste of people. So the Dalits have one church, the Brahmins have one church. And overwhelmingly, the class is moving towards we should have distinct churches for distinct people. And I realized for the first time, my entire classmates, they don't know what the gospel actually is. And they can't separate it from the culture that they've grown up in, which is, the homogeneous unit principle, McGavran's concept. Now, don't get me wrong. There is a place for homogeneous connection, especially when it comes to immigrants moving to a new country. They're trying to hold on to their language, trying to hold on to their ethnicity. So I grew up going to Tamil church in Chicago. There's, a Telugu church here, Filipino church here. So don't get me wrong. There is a place for those to hold on to some sense of identity and culture as we're moving our children to a land that we don't know. But there's no way to read the Bible. There's no way to read Galatians or Ephesians and not see that God is restoring to himself all people to now create one new humanity where we are celebrating one another's cultures and not seeing one as different. One small practice we do at our church is we do communion by intinction. So you walk up, and you're talking thousands of people. This is not like a small feat. And we have people holding the bread and the juice. And every week we have a different bread from a different ethnic culture.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
So we'll make it, and we won't say, this is why we just say, hey, today the bread for communion is Ethiopian. Today it's Jewish challah bread. It's lavash Armenian bread. It's non-Indian bread. So it's just a simple way of saying God is creating for himself a new people to be restored to one another. And it's the ability for all of us to lay down our privileges, to lay down ourselves as not being the priority. Most of us feel something when we're not the priority. And we're creating environments where you don't have to be the priority. And so we do songs in different languages. And then and those are all beautiful kind of corporate expressions. But the most beautiful expression is to sit at a table and just ask two questions. What are you grieving? And what are you joyful about? And you'll begin to hear two things. You'll begin to hear the distinctness of what people are grieving, especially if they're immigrants leaving a particular culture. But you'll also hear the commonality that as human beings, we all have grief, we all have joy, and we get to move in the story of God together at the table. So we are finding God at the table. And I would argue that hospitality, Rosario Butterfield, one of my favorite authors, writes, the gospel comes with the house key. Rodney Stark has done great work on this in his books and his writing. Diana Butler Bass talks about hospitality in the early church. I would contend that hospitality is the only Christian practice that accomplishes the Great Commission and the Great Commandment at the same time. Moving people together to break bread at the table, to share our stories with one another, finding Jesus in the communal life together. And that's what I would say. You cannot create an intercultural, interethnic, intergenerational movement, whether it's a family or it's a church or an organization, if you do not embrace the communal life. Because that is where I would argue where you find God is in the communal life with other people. And while there's space for silence and solitude and personal devotion and prayer, I think those are snapshots in the life of Jesus. But the totality of the Gospels shows him with people, always with people. And so one of my contentions would be there's this kind of new movement of spiritual formation rising up, which is building on the work of Willard and Nowen and Jones. But I think one of the things that's missing is I think those guys distinctly talked about the communal movement in formation, an integrated movement of story, not isolated practices. And the example I give to people is, again, playing basketball. A lot of my references are sports or food. But one of my favorite workouts in practice was the 5-man weave. And I'm a guard. I'm fast. So it's really fun for me to do a 5-man weave with 4 other guards because they're fast. But when I'm doing it with power forwards and centers, I have to adjust my speed to move at their speed. But I can't just practice the 5-man weave on my own. I can't just I can only do that if I have 5 guys. And I think that's the same in the Christian walk. Finding God, you cannot find God if you only aim to walk with him as, spiritually isolated from the church, from deeper community, from serving the poor, from giving your life to the cause of the poor, and from opening your home, the table. The table is the most important room in the house. And that's what I saw growing up. In American culture, I saw that the bedroom was the most important room in the house. But in Eastern culture, the table is the most important room. Nobody knows you unless they've actually sat at your table, opened your fridge, seen how you eat, breaking bread together, blessing one another together, honoring one another's stories. So I don't think it's possible without that. And for some reason in the American West, we've taken the gospel of atonement and we've said, no, that's the gospel. Jesus died for your sins. And I'm like, he did. This is a big deal. But if that's only what the gospel is, well, what does Jesus mean then when he says, repent for the kingdom of God has come near? He doesn't even talk about the cross till way later. And I hear a lot of people constantly, when I talk to them about this is what the movement of the gospel is, I'll constantly someone will say, you just got to preach the gospel, preach the gospel, preach the gospel. And I'll tell you that I'll have my sort of Princess Bride movement, the Indigo Montoya. I'm like, you keep using that word. I do not think I don't think it means what you think it means. Like, it doesn't mean this. It is a movement of God creating a new kingdom, the consummation of the kingdom, the rule and reign of God, the comprehensive will of God, the effective range of God's will, moving together, creating a new distinct humanity. And this is what the gospel does, reconciles us to God and reconciles us to one another, where our distinctions can actually be celebrated. And there's some beautiful moments of my wife and I celebrating our distinctions, the way that she sees the world and the way that I see the world. Neither of them are wrong, but now we get to create a new family where both of these stories are heralded as sacred and powerful form. And is it messy? Of course it's messy. It's incredibly messy. I never grew up celebrating 4th of July. America's independence meant nothing to me. But August 15th is an important day for me. August 15th is India's independence. Korea became independent. South Korea became independent that same month. Indonesia. I mean, it was a bad month for the British. They lost a lot in August of 1947 to 1948. So that's a big deal. Diwali is a big deal. So these reciting the Gloria Patri when it comes to Sunday. That's a big deal. Singing the doxology. So trying to bring the best of everything and creating something together. And it's not clean in any way, shape, or form. If anybody wants to do interracial, anything, and they think it's easy, they need to find a new hobby, because it's not easy. Because you're working with things that you've always believed is the priority and the way that things should be. And you can hold something as sacred without being dogmatic about this is the way it has to be done. And so creating that in family, creating rhythms for story, creating rhythms for worship and prayer, all these kind of things can be done. And just, I think part of it's my personality. My personality is I'm a yes person. I'm like, can we try this? Yeah, let's try it. Let's go for it. Like what, unless it's a sin, I think we should go for it. So I think part of that's my personality. Part of that is growing up overseas and seeing how communal life, worship and faith and formation worship was happening overseas, and then moving to America and finding, and there's so much beauty in the church in America. I think that's one thing, because I came and I saw it differently. Of course, I think there's issues, but I saw a lot of beauty that I never saw overseas. Serving, like people serving, people contributing, people wanting to be there. Those are things I saw here that I didn't see in the East. And so we want to be really careful that we don't just say, this is the one way to do it. But the gathering of God's people, the table, I love what Safwat Marzouk says. He says, the sign of God's activity in the world is a worshiping people. And we want to create spaces where you have every nation, tribe, and tongue, fueling the vision of that God is worthy of the worship of all people. So let's bring all people here. And now in America, the world is coming here. I mean, I can go walk down the street and I can have Indonesian food, Ethiopian food, Vietnamese food, Indian food, just everywhere. The world is coming here. So trying to create a vision for people to have a dynamic, gospel-centered, spirit-filled communal life. So that's where I would say I am finding God, and we are finding God, challenging people to walk the way of Jesus together. So long answer, but that's where I'd say we're finding God.
Beautiful, beautiful thoughts. And I think how it goes back to the very beginning of the story of Advent, when the angels say to the shepherd, this will be good news of great joy, which shall be for all the peoples. And what do you mean all the peoples? Not supposed to, like them? Yep, all the people. And so it's not good news for any of the people until it is good news for all the people. Group, this has been incredibly rich. There's pretty much everything that you have talked about we could unpack for an hour. I'm so grateful for that. Everybody listening today, as you think about that gospel of the availability of the kingdom, which when it's rightly proclaimed, always has the effect of producing disciples. Yep, that's what I want. That's what I want to pursue. Keep in mind today, not the priority. Love that thought. When I can be present with people and I'm not the priority, I'm entering into a little bit of the experience of Jesus, who did not consider equality with grounds to be a foundation for his making himself the priority. And then the table, that's a theme that keeps coming up as we're going through this series. When I'm with other people, when I am eating, to have arms wide open instead of like this. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope we get to do this again.
Absolutely. I would love it. We could just talk about all your books that I've read.
That would be a very brief conversation.
No, I still remember a sermon you gave at Willow Creek on a Wednesday night when I was in high school, and you were teaching on Revelation. And I still remember you brought out a newspaper and you read the Chicago Bulls had just won, and you were describing how you read this newspaper, but if you don't know the context, this all seems foreign to you. And that was just so eye-opening to me. So I would come on Wednesday nights, as soon as school was over, do my homework, sports practice, boom, straight to hear you teach. So,
well, I'm really grateful for how God is using your life, just for your gifts and your wiring. The church needs that so much. So that's a great joy. Wonderful to think that there was a connection way back then. But it's an honor to get to have this conversation together with you. I will be cheering you on. Love to stay connected, know what's going on in Denver at Life Cave with you and Hannah. Man, God bless you and bless your ministry, and thank you.
Hey, if you like that video, go ahead and subscribe to our channel so that you don't miss any future episodes in this series, Finding God in Your World, where John will sit down with a different guest each episode, asking them that simple question: where are you finding God in your world? If you want more resources, head on over to becomeyou.com/subscribe. where you can let us know if you'd like to receive the emails that go along with each video with extra content and information, or if you want to sign up for the text reminders whenever we drop a new video. Also, if you've got a prayer request, there's a group of us who meet each weekday, Monday through Friday, to pray for viewers just like yourself. So you can send us your prayer request to 855-888-0444, and we would love to pray for you. We'll catch you next time.